Greetings, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We'd like to take this moment to offer our respects to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. If you haven't already switched to your speaker view from the upper right-hand corner of your screen where it says view, please do so now. It'll actually enhance your viewing so that you get a clean cut of whoever is speaking at any time. So tonight's event is called Moving Forward, Solidarity, Courage, and Responsibility in a Time of Uncertainty. It is brought to you by City Lights in conjunction with Human Rights Watch and PEN America. As the presidential inauguration approaches, many Americans are asking, where do we go from here? How do we move forward? Tonight's discussion focuses upon the importance of solidarity in times of political crisis and uncertainty. We have brought together leading advocates and activists who will explore the most pressing issues: immigration, racial justice, women's rights, the environment, education, and more. Together, they will explore how civil society's commitment to resistance and social responsibility can rekindle hope and inspire meaningful action for change, even in the most challenging of times. We'll also talk about the importance of solidarity and of building bridges at a time like this. Moderating tonight's panel will be Ipek Burnett. Ipek is the co-chair of Human Rights Watch Executive Committee in San Francisco. She works with nonprofit organizations and foundations that specialize in social justice, human rights, and democracy. She is a Turkish-American author whose published work offers a psychological critique of social, cultural, and political issues. Joining her tonight on our panel will be Fred Blackwell, the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, one of the largest community foundations in the country. Also with us is Susan Griffin, the author of over 20 books. Her classic work, Woman and Nature, was an inspiration to ecofeminism. Also joining us is Kyle Knight, a senior researcher on health and LGBT rights at Human Rights Watch. He is a journalist who has worked for Agence France Presse and for the UN's humanitarian news service, IRIN. He sits on the educational board of the Annals of LGBTQ Public and Population Health Journal. And also with us tonight is Summer Lopez, the Chief Program Officer of Free Expression Programs at PEN America. She previously worked for the United States Agency for International Development, where she served as Deputy Director of the Office of Democracy, Human Rights, and Governments. She is also interim co-CEO of PEN America. And last but not least, we are delighted to have Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Emmy-nominated filmmaker, and Tony-nominated producer, Jose Antonio Vargas, also joining us for the evening. I will now turn the helm over to Ipek Burnett to get this evening started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Peter, for introducing our remarkable panel of thought leaders, advocates, and activists. And thank you to City Lights for hosting this timely, very important, and much needed discussion. We are, like you said, just a week away from the US presidential inauguration, days away at this point. And I recently looked up that word, inauguration, and learned that the root of it, augur, apparently refers to ancient Roman priests interpreting the omens before an important undertaking, a political or military undertaking. And they do so by reading the flight patterns of birds. So fascinating, right? We obviously are not Roman priests, but in a way today we are gathered here to interpret the omens, to read the signs. From immigration to racial justice, environment, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, education, public health, free speech, there is so much at stake in this moment in this country and in our communities. So we will share our insights, our ideas, our inspirations. We'll try to offer interpretations, make connections, try to make meaning, so we better understand how we can move forward with solidarity, with courage, with a solid and strong sense of responsibility, with vision and intention. Since we have so much that we're going to cover, I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to invite Jose Antonio Vargas to the table. Jose is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and of course, an immigrant rights activist. And when his book, Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen came out, I remember buying that right away, reading it right away, and appreciating it so much. I gifted it to multiple people in my life. And funny enough, two of my friends also gifted it to me. So I want to start right there with that, Jose. For those of you with that book, for those of you who don't know you perhaps as much, can you share your personal story with us and how you came to write that book?
Uh, Thank you. That's very, very generous. You can hear me okay, right? I'm zooming in from New York City at the moment. I live in Berkeley, or as I like to call it, the Republic of Berkeley, where people fight over kale. Um, but I left 65 degrees of weather to be here in New York, where it's what I think 30 degrees right now. Really happy to be with all of you, and thank you for inviting me. So to answer your question more directly, just a quick little background on my story. I'm a very proud product of the Bay Area of Mountain View, California, where I grew up. I was born in the Philippines, and if you're all watching, if you see an Asian-looking person with a Latino name, it means they're Filipino. Just FYI. So I was born in the Philippines, and then my mom sent me to live with her parents, my grandparents, who had already immigrated to Mountain View in the mid 80s. So I arrived in Mountain View in 1993. It was those between 1993 and 1996 were kind of the innocent era, because around 1997, 4 years after arriving here, I found out that I was sent here illegally. I found out that the papers that my grandparents, my grandfather in particular, gave me were fake. And in many ways, I think that's when my journalism career got started, because I was like, why are they fake? Why is it that my grandparents were able to naturalize, and why couldn't they just bring me here legally? Why isn't my mom coming? Like, what does this mean? And even back then, this was in the Proposition 187 era. The media I consumed, may it be local TV, the San Jose Mercury News, the San Francisco Chronicle, radio, already told me that if you were here with fake papers, if you were here illegally as an illegal alien, it meant you were Latino, specifically Mexican. That was already so prevalent back in 1997. And it's even more now. So I was really lucky, though. And in the book that you mentioned, I really wanted to name all of the kindness that really enveloped me. I was just really blessed to have been raised where I was in Mountain View in the Bay Area, where people had resources and had privilege. And, I think the question of privilege is, what do you do to risk the privilege? Right. And so I was surrounded by educators who were so confused as I was, why I wasn't, eligible for financial aid to go to college, why I wasn't able to go back to the Philippines and see my mom. And so in many ways, writing that book for me was about really trying to understand, what does it mean, the interior life of quote unquote illegal aliens, right? And to be honest, I wrote the book, I was 37, and my heroes are like Toni Morrison and Stephen Sondheim and Mike Nichols and Billy Wilder, and they never wrote their memoirs. And so I was like, what am I doing, a 37-year-old writing a memoir? Like, what? So thankfully, my editor and I came up with this idea of writing about the kind of the emotional process. And if you're undocumented in this country, you lie, you try to pass, and you hide. So lying, passing, hiding. So once we came up with that kind of structure, it felt okay as a 37-year-old, because I'm convinced that life doesn't begin until 40. I'm about to be 44. So that convinced me that there was enough that happened in my life that I could fit it in lying, passing, and hiding. And in many ways, I would venture to say that America is stuck in the lying, passing, and hiding. I think we lie about our history from each other. right? In many ways, when we say that we're a country of immigrants, I think in many ways that's, as Gore Vidal would say, the United States of amnesia, right? Like we erase the slaughter of Native American people. We try to push under the rug, just keep not talking about the costs of chattel slavery, which is so unique to America, to American history. We try to forget that if you're not Native American or a descendant of enslaved peoples, like you came from somewhere, and your legality, such as it is a matter of what was legal back when your ancestors came, your grandparents, your great grandparents, and what laws were in place, right? And it's actually just in many ways, a luck of the draw, right? And so the work that we do, the work that I've been doing, I ask this question: how do you define American? So often I just wear a T-shirt. So I started asking this question when, against the advice of 28 immigration lawyers back in 2011, when President Obama, was deporting 400,000 immigrants a year. I raised my hand and I said, "Hey, I'm here illegally. What do you want to do with me?" And to be honest, the biggest shock of putting my hand up and asking that question was nothing. Right? Like, in many ways, I had traded like this life, this closeted immigrant life in limbo, with this public life in limbo, in which I was too inconvenient. My story didn't fit the narrative of immigrants in this country. They weren't quite sure what to do with someone like me. And in reality, though, I think that's a metaphor for how we think of undocumented people in this country. We're totally comfortable that a third, or if not more, of our farmers in this country who make sure that we have food to eat are undocumented, right? We know that. During the pandemic, we even called them essential workers, but clearly not essential enough, right? So that they could have, driver's licenses, for example, in a state like Texas, where you have 1.8 million undocumented people and they can't drive, or in a state like Florida. Governor DeSantis had a press conference earlier today, making sure that the state of Florida, where there's 1 million undocumented people, 1 million, right? He actually said today in front of the Florida press corps that he will do everything he can to cooperate with the incoming Trump administration. So this work that we do at Define American really strikes at the heart of, when it comes to immigration, the media, in whatever forms you consume it, is not a slice of the pie. It's actually the whole pan. And your media diet dictates what you think and feel about immigration. Someone whose American education was consuming and participating in legacy media. I grew up at the San Francisco Chronicle. I worked at the Washington Post. I worked at the New Yorker. We now live at a time when the Washington Post and the New Yorker and the San Francisco Chronicle don't dictate what is the narrative of this country, right? The reality is, by media, I mean, yes, TV and film, I mean, news and books, it's YouTube, it's TikTok, it's Twitch, it's Kick, it's Twitter, it's Joe Rogan. By media, I actually mean you, right? Media is everywhere. Everyone in this Zoom right now consumes media regularly, and you spread media and you produce media. And it's actually up to you to fight the mis and disinformation about immigration that is rampant, right? So rampant, in fact, that Democrats in Congress right now are about to pass a bill. It passed the House. It's about to enter the Senate, that undocumented people in this country are not thought of as people enough that they're actually entitled to due process. If someone actually thinks that you have committed some sort of a minor crime, they can arrest you, right? Like that's happening like right now. Because of this decentralization and fragmentation of media, Americans are further than ever from being on the same page, right? And so what we do at Define American in this organization is, how do we make sure that we help storytellers, from journalists to filmmakers, right, to authors? How do we make sure that you're not spreading any more misinformation, and that you actually talk about immigration and immigrants accurately and with the requisite facts and context? Because facts do matter, right? And when it comes to this issue, we call it at Define American the movable middle. most people on this issue are in the middle. They're not on either extreme. And our job is to make sure that we get them, that we reach them, that we can move them through stories, through facts. You know, people are moved by many, many different ways. Sometimes it's a podcast, sometimes it's a book, sometimes it's a TikTok video, right? So how do we help people do that? And the last thing I'll say, you know, given that this is MLK weekend, when I decided against the advice of the lawyers to tell my story, my model was actually the letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King's letter that he wrote while he was, you know, detained in Alabama. And I had just done this interview at Define American, figured if Joe Rogan is that important, I fought against this for a while. I ended up launching a podcast, so check it out. It's called Define American with Jose Antonio Vargas. I was in Houston a few weeks ago before as the holidays was rolling along, because in Houston, Texas, 1 out of 10 people is undocumented. I interviewed this guy, Gene Wu, who just got elected head of the Texas Democrats, immigrant from China. He lives in a district in Houston where 1 out of 3 people is undocumented. 1 out of 3. Right? Latinos, Caribbeans, Asians, different backgrounds. And we ended up having this conversation about what does it mean, right, for you to be an ally and to be an advocate. And then what we ended up talking about is, if it wasn't for the civil rights movement, if it wasn't for Black people fighting for their civil rights and being joined by white allies, there would not be 22 million Asian people in this country immigrating, right? The 1965 Immigration Act is in debt to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So we talked about this. We put it on TikTok. To our surprise, they got more than 1 million views because so many people, especially Black people, Black Americans, right, were like, hey, can we have that conversation? And I'm saying that because in that letter from Birmingham jail, you know, when Martin Luther King said, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, right, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We either live through that and step up and really understand that we are witnesses to each other's lives, or we succumb to the bottom of what this administration is about to actually live us through. So thank you for having me here.
Oh, Jose, thank you so much. Really, so much. Especially for ending on that note too. What I really appreciate about your work is when you talk about your personal story, you're also talking about the history of immigration in the United States. And with your personal story, you are challenging the dominant narrative, which needs to be challenged and complicated. And there are so many voices like yours. You're also amplifying through your work and bringing the Define America's work to it, addressing the media. These are so important. And you already mentioned it. I was going to mention it too. For everyone, I encourage you to check out the YouTube channel for Define America, where Jose interviews activists, advocates, immigrants. It is so eye-opening, empowering, inspiring. So thank you, Jose. And thank you also for your commitment and your courage. I really want to underline the courage here. And now I'm going to turn to Susan Griffin, again, talking about courage and commitment. And the beautiful quote Jose ended with also speaks to us here. Susan is a feminist philosopher, poet, essayist, playwright, one of my favorite authors. And what I really appreciate about her work is how she weaves in so many insights, ideas, feelings, talks about so many different issue areas, climate change to nuclear warfare, sexism, racism, democracy. And she does it always so poetically, very intuitively, perceptively. Whatever she writes, it becomes very personal, again, very intimate. And in that approach, she beautifully highlights our interconnection, our interdependence. Yet, of course, we're at a time, instead of our interconnectivity, which should be so obvious with environmental collapse, wildfires, pandemics, it should be so obvious, yet there's such stubborn denial of it, right? There's so much division, so much fragmentation, separation. And Peter mentioned your book, Susan, Women and Nature, which you wrote 40 years ago, which still is so, we resonate with it so much after this many years, 4 decades. What are your thoughts on that? Where were we 40 plus years ago when you were writing that book about in terms of women's rights, in terms of environment, and where are we now? What do you see? What do you observe?
Well, let me go back even further, and that's this the era that I sort of came of age when I went to college, just as this particular era of the 50s was vanishing, and it had a rather dramatic exit, because the latter part of the 50s was dominated by a senator named Senator Joe McCarthy, and I think it's good to remember this fellow now, because we've got a similar, we've got not only a senator, but a president and a whole cabinet with similar proclivities. That is to attack other people, call them un-American, wanting to deport millions of people. We've seen this show before, and it was a rough ride, but eventually McCarthy was brought down. So I think what you mentioned about the connections is terribly important. I by the way, Jose, I'm from the Republic of Berkeley too, the Republic of Kale. And that's where I am right now. So I want to talk about feminism in particular, because I'm known as a feminist philosopher. I think of myself as a feminist, but not exclusively as a feminist, as many other things, including an ecologist and somebody in favor, a fighter for civil rights. But there's a way that issue can be construed as very narrow. It's that in itself, that you could ever construe a movement addressing the rights of half of humanity, or actually a little over half of humanity, as sort of a minority side issue tells you a lot. But in fact, I think that the time has come that we should not think of feminism as a woman's issue. It is also a man's issue. Gender is the issue. We see this, of course, very clearly in the way that people who are transsexual or just dragging, just like to go out and drag, are being attacked. Isn't it interesting, by the way, that how women have been doing drag for ages, and it's very fashionable often in Vogue magazine to wear suits and ties, but men are really, really mustn't, go around in dresses. And the reason for that is that if you go around in a dress, you're lowering yourself on the hierarchy of power, and that's what masculinity is about. Masculinity is not something that is biological, nor is femininity. Neither of these are biologically created. No more than the masculinity and aggression, masculinity in quotation marks, and aggression demonstrated by soldiers is biological. The training, young men have to go through rigorous and really cruel even training to get them to do what soldiers have to do. It doesn't come naturally to them to murder people. And gender is basically socially constructed. And that's something that I believed all my life. And I wasn't the first one to see that. If you if you look at Virginia Woolf's book, Orlando, in which the major character shifts from chapter to chapter, from one sex to the other, Virginia Woolf was examining that too, as, by the way, so was Proust examining that from the point of view of a man. And so I think it's one that I'm trying to think, excuse me, I'm stuttering a bit, but I have Parkinson's disease and it does this to me. But one of the things that it is very important right now is for us to see the connection between various movements and to reach out to each other in our movements and act as one. Think of the way we describe social movements. We talk about a wave. We talk about something's in the air. Well, I'm very thinking about that now because of the fires in Southern California. But, you know, these are very, very powerful forces, waves and wind, very powerful. But they're not singular. They're in nature, they're a collective phenomenon. They're created by the environment itself, by several elements in the environment. And that's our strength as those of us who believe in democracy and kindness and fairness and economic equality and welcoming immigrants because we all come from immigrants, most of us. Well, even some Native Americans might have migrated from one area to the other. So, you know, that we all have had that experience. And what we need to do is to recognize the connections between these issues, and not just, you know, a coalition as in the sense of, you know, I'll scratch your back and you scratch mine. It's interesting how the term reciprocity has sort of one meaning and applied to the world that Trump controls, which is transactional. You know, I'll give you $5 and you give me 5 chocolate drops or something, you know. But reciprocity has another meaning, which is much larger than that. And that is that we belong to the same universe. We exchange energy constantly. Well, our feelings are shared. Our feelings are invited. We are all metaphors for each other. And we're born of the same parentage, which is nature. And so what's important in that is that that's a very large force that everybody is part of. And the more we can appeal to that, the more we will have power in fighting the next 4 years, which I find terribly frightening. I know I'm off the subject of feminism here, but it's all feminism. It's all ecology, really. But several years ago, I guess it's a lot of years ago, or maybe it's about 10 years ago, I read Erik Larson's book, In the Garden of the Beasts. Does anybody know that book? It's an incredible book that makes the years when Hitler came to power in Germany and the beginning of the crimes of the Third Reich come to life, and you feel them from moment to moment. I've been a student of the Holocaust for years, many years before I read that book, but this got to me, and I said, I see all the warning signs. This was 10 years ago. I see all the warning signs here now in America that this can happen. And one of the reasons it happened in Germany was that there was this huge differential. Not only was there inflation and poverty, but there was a huge differential between the wealthy and the poor. And that this inequality in society is really, really very dangerous. People suffer terribly, and they want to blame somebody. It makes them feel more secure to have someone to blame. When they can't find a way to survive or feed their family properly. And people suffer, of course, terrible deprivation in a society with such inequality. So it produces a kind of insanity. And we need to be aware that we're on the cusp of fascism and reach each other with our best selves and make room for the stories of others to come into our own causes, and to think deeply, like, how is it that feminism is related to ecology? Well, I wrote a book about that. And but it's not enough to get it intellectually that the diminution and destructive attitudes towards women are related to the same attitudes towards nature. It's not enough to do that. You need to feel it too. You need to feel the connection. And if we do that, we really can't be stopped. So I would say, think deeply, look at the real causes of things and how it's all connected, and feel yourself as part of the whole, part of that wind, part of the waves, part of the same world, whether it's a world of commerce or nature or philosophy. And we have a chance of surviving.
Susan, thank you so much. That's exactly what your books do to me. Think deeply, feel connected, and feel also deeply as well. And this conversation just now captured the essence of everything you do. It's always so rich, your offerings, so complex and layered. And you beautifully showed once again the connection. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here with us. And now we're gonna move from the Republic of Berkeley to San Francisco Foundation, to Fred Blackwell, the CEO of San Francisco Foundation. He is a movement builder, a community leader here in San Francisco and the larger Bay Area, of course, with a really keen vision of racial equity, inclusion, justice, economic opportunity for all. So we're honored to have you here with us today, Fred. In the aftermath of the last election, Fred shared this powerful, moving letter in which he wrote, I want to quote this: "It would be easy to succumb to discouragement, to retreat in the face of uncertainty and conflict. But," he wrote, "instead we'll forge ahead with renewed determination." And he said, to achieve our vision, we must actively build our collective power, a power fueled by love. Fred, can you tell us more about this collective power? How do we build it? How do we maintain it?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And Susan and Jose, thank you for your words. A lot of what you had to say really resonated with me, and I'll probably pick up on a few of the themes that you all have laid out in my remarks. And to City Lights, thank you for doing this, because I think a part of what's going to be essential for all of us in moving through this next period is to do some analysis, processing, and strategizing in community. So thank you for kind of pulling us together. What I wanted to do is offer a little bit of observations and context and analysis around kind of the moment that we're in, particularly as it relates to racial justice and equity, and kind of share a little bit of a personal story in there. I also, though, want to kind of share three observations that I've had, 3 or 4 observations that I've had just in the work and our work with grantees and activists around kind of how people are reflecting on the moment. And also share 3 or 4 things that I'm observing in terms of trends. And so just by way of observation, you know, Jose, you talked about civil rights movement, Black Power movement, and the kind of power of the Black community. That's what I grew up in. My grandparents were very involved in the civil rights movement. My parents were really heavily involved in the Black Power movement in Oakland, which is where I grew up. They went as far as to send me to the school that was founded and run by the Black Panther Party. And so the kind of movement work that you talk about has been something that I've always been kind of surrounded by. And what's been interesting for me in kind of my coming of age, which was during the early 70s and 80s, was that there wasn't the same kind of movement to join in terms of kind of people being able to step into and join the civil rights movement, or people being able to step into and readily kind of get engaged in the Black Power movement. And so I and a lot of people in my age cohort who were really interested in this work, concerned about racial equity and activism and inclusion, I describe often, we became very professionalized. And what I mean by that is, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to write good memos and create good PowerPoints with the right amount of white space and the right number of bullets, and to put together really sophisticated data analysis and provide compelling presentations around that stuff, and doing white papers and engaging in research and data analysis. And that is very different. It's complementary to, but it's very different than the kinds of things that people were engaging in and the kinds of activism that people were engaging in during the civil rights movement, during the Black Power movement as well. And the result of that is, the formation of what I would consider really good language around racial justice and racial equity and inclusion and diversity and why it was important. And it actually gained some momentum. We saw activism and we saw advocacy that led to organizations and corporations building in DEI units and building that into their HR and making commitments to supporting diversity and inclusion with their grant making, and foundations adopting more of the language. I often was saying, like maybe pre-George Floyd, when this work was going and it was gathering momentum, that equity felt like the new coconut water. That, it was around all the time. Everybody was always talking about it, but you rarely saw somebody actually drinking it. And so that kind of all hit a crescendo after the murder of George Floyd. And I think what we saw was the combination of that professionalism that I talked about, joined with the anger, the emotion of the time, and the advocacy and the organizing of that time. And it created a moment that many of us thought would last a lot longer than it did. And what we are experiencing, I think right now, is a little bit of backlash to that, actually a lot of backlash to that. At the foundation, we have had a North Star that was about creating a greater degree of racial equity and economic inclusion for the last 10 years. And it's been amazing to kind of reflect on these last 10 years and think about how the context has changed for us. When we first drew that line in the sand, we weren't the only ones. We are part of a small group of kind of foundations that were making those kinds of commitments. We all of a sudden had wind in our sails in the summer of 2020 and the years beyond that. And now we are experiencing very intense resistance. DEI is a four-letter word. You can see many corporations dropping their DEI programs. We see the Supreme Court coming out with the rulings that are undermining affirmative action and the kind of progress that's been made, discouraging people legally and through bullying from actually naming race, naming diversity, naming inclusion as things that they want to advance. And so that is the moment that we are in. And that's the kind of context that I wanted to lay out there. This last election has brought about a level of reflection in the field, though, that I have not seen in a long time. And there's just a couple of things that I would kind of highlight in terms of some of the realizations that I wanted to bring in that I'm starting to kind of really wrap their heads around. One is both Susan and Jose talked about the importance of, or the centrality of notions of like love and empathy in our field and in our work when it comes to immigration, feminism, you name it, humanity, etc. One of the things I think we realized is that it is far easier to engage in fear and hate from afar than it is to engage in love and empathy from afar. Love and empathy require a level of intimacy and proximity that hate and fear do not. And so for those of us who really see the currency of love and empathy, it really requires us to be very deliberate about how we position ourselves, how we talk to people, how we get into proximity with people to really bring forward those kinds of emotions and those kinds of commitments. And I think Jose talked about how as a society, we have grown farther and farther apart. We really have to fight against that in moments like these, and to be more in community, be more proximate with one another, and be in conversation. That's one realization. I think another realization is that giving in to advocacy or joining trends is different than actually having buy-in. And what I mean by that is, I just talked about how a lot of corporations are starting to move away from DEI and their programming that they do, et cetera. But there are a number of companies who have maintained commitment to that. And there's one that just mentioned it recently is that Costco actually talked about they affirmed their commitment to DEI, and they didn't talk about it in ways that were about succumbing to advocacy or being pressured to keep those programs. They talk about it in ways that said, this is better for our bottom line. We are bought into this. We see this as a concept that is important for our business. And so for folks that are committed to it and bought into it, it doesn't those kinds of commitments don't go away when you're bought in. And I think one of the things that we have done is mistaken the commitments that have been made, the kinds of programs that have been committed. We've misconstrued commitment, and it's been more about succumbing to advocacy. A third realization is that people want results. People like the flowery language. People want to be inspired by what they hear, but that's not enough. They really need to be in a situation where they're experiencing the results that come from the language. And a part of what has happened is that the way that we have talked about things, the way that we have kind of characterized this work has led to a smaller tent, a more narrow tent of people who can engage in racial equity, economic inclusion, and racial justice. And not only has the tent gotten smaller, but what's happening under the tent is looking like a circus. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of kind of dispute within organizations that are committed to racial justice about where to go. You've seen a number of organizations being torn down, a lot of disputes and a lot of conflict happening inside the organizations. And so, like I said, things have been narrowed, but they also have become more chaotic. And I think those realizations, the fact that all those things are happening, I think are really important. The fear and the hate versus the love and the empathy, giving in the advocacy versus buy-in, and results over rhetoric, I think is all important things for us to keep in mind. I want to end, though, I'll almost end with some of the trends that we're seeing, and that I think people are reflecting, and we're in a lot of conversations with people in this moment, and there are things that I think are really important to share. One is, you remember during 2016, the first time that the Trump administration came in, there were people that were unfollowing family members who voted in a different direction, and friends. People kind of circled the wagons and kind of narrowed their pool of people who they were talking to. I think the time around what I'm seeing is more people thinking about less about canceling and more about reflection. And inclusion and proximity, and really trying to understand why people are making the decisions that they're making and voting in the ways that they're voting, rather than canceling them because of the decisions that they make. And I think that that is a really important trend that I am seeing. Another trend as it relates to racial equity and economic inclusion and racial justice that I'm seeing is a reclaiming of the narrative. And what I mean by that is we have allowed the narrative around equity and inclusion and diversity to somehow be characterized as exclusionary. And I think that the reality is that equity is just and fair inclusion in a society where everyone can participate, prosper, thrive, and reach their full potential, underlining everyone. But the thing is that the belief is that the way that you get to everybody thriving is that you focus in on the folks who are farthest away from thriving. And I think that really we have to reclaim this notion of all in the work that is included and the benefits that are associated with racial justice and racial equity. And I see people really starting to lean into that. Third trend that I want to lift up is, there's been a lot of kind of debate in the field around the efficacy of programs and services when trying to achieve racial justice and racial equity versus changing policies and systems. And I think one of the trends that I'm seeing is that this is not an either or for folks. It's a both and. I mentioned that I went to the Panther School in Oakland. One of the great Panther sayings is that in order to lead the people, you have to feed the people. Which means you have to meet people's basic needs and make sure that they are fed before you can kind of get them into a place where you are leading them into a place of movement building, power building, systems change, and policy change. And so this combination of really providing direct services and programs and meeting people where they are and making sure that their basic needs are met, and use that as an opportunity to bring them into a movement and a conversation about racial equity and economic inclusion is really important. Last thing that I want to say in terms of the trends that we're seeing is people are moving away from empire building like these huge organizations that are focused in on these issues, to moving into what I would characterize as ecosystem building, thinking about the kinds of partnerships, the kinds of communities that need to be in solidarity, the different kinds of folks that need to be around the table together and working together in order to achieve what we're trying to achieve. And I think that that's also another important trend. Jose, I love the fact that you brought up the fact that we are days away from Martin Luther King's birthday. I am a Morehouse grad. So is Dr. Martin Luther King. And so this time of year, I really start to reflect on just the litany of powerful and inspiring Martin Luther King quotes. And I think one is particularly important for this moment, particularly when we talk about love and power. And it is this: power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. I just think in this moment, that is one of the more powerful Martin Luther King quotes, because we are in a moment where people in power lack love. And the people that are really harnessing love don't have the kind of power that it takes to kind of move in the direction that we want to, because of the lack of the kind of organizing and solidarity that's needed to build power. Last thing I want to say here, another one of my favorite Morehouse men is Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman had a quote: "Keep fresh before me my moments of my highest resolve." And for me, what that means is to keep fresh that moment when your resolve was high, when your beliefs were high, when you were willing to fight for something that you really believed in. Those moments when we are willing to go to the streets, when we are willing to show up to the council meetings, those moments when we're ready to call our senators and our president, those moments when we're ready to really engage with others to achieve what we want to achieve as a collective society. As we move away, as things get in the way of all of that, our day-to-day chores, all that stuff, we move away from those moments. And this is the time to recall those moments of high resolve.
Fred, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your observations, your insights. This was very thought-provoking and inspirational, and this is what I really appreciate about every time I hear Fred speak. Even in the most challenging times, he uplifts me by reminding me of the deep well of resilience and determination in our communities. And that quote by Martin Luther King Jr. Love, the end of it, justice at its best is love correcting everything that
Stands in the way of love.
stands in the way of.
Correcting everything that stands in the way of love.
Thank you. Thank you for that. What a gift. And now I would like to turn to Kyle Knight from Human Rights Watch, Interim Deputy Director of LGBT Rights at Human Rights Watch. And I get to call Kyle a colleague of mine, and I really wanted him to be a part of this panel, not just because of his expertise in LGBT rights, which is very important to our conversation, and also because he's able to bring to us the global perspective, right? From his work at Human Rights Watch, Kyle, you research and write about Nepal, Poland, Thailand, Japan, Russia, India. So having this wide lens and knowledge of the global trends, threats, as well as of course, wins, the gains for LGBT rights, where do you see us now, US, and where is the US going?
Sure. Thanks so much. How's my audio? We good? Okay, great. And thanks to everyone else on the panel. I'm sitting here making a reading list as you all talk, so it's been very inspirational. Thanks for coming up with homework. So look, I think it's important to start by simply acknowledging that in particular over the last decade or so, the US government has played an incredibly important role on global LGBT rights issues. There's a lot of different things you can point to, but for me, I like to look back at the inflection point when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State under Obama in 2012. She chose to dedicate her entire address at the United Nations Human Rights Council to the global state of LGBT rights. And more importantly, the next day when she flew back to Washington, she pushed the government to start investing money and putting money where their mouth was, which is a really, really big move. And we're talking tens of millions of dollars going to small LGBT organizations all over the world, an unprecedented funding push from the US. This came, of course, with political cover and sort of all of a sudden being able to have these discussions in spaces where you couldn't even just a few years prior. It also gave a major shift in how US diplomats around the world were enabled and encouraged to act. Again, tons of examples we can think of, but one that stands out to me is a few years back in Bangladesh, two of the most prominent LGBT activists were murdered in their apartment with machetes by vigilantes. And within 24 hours, a lot of the other visible LGBT activists who were known on social media and stuff like that were able to actually physically take shelter in the US embassy. And then the US government helped them get visas to get out until things cooled down and they could assess the security situation and figure out how to pick up where they left off. Those were the types of things that Washington was able to do around the world. And of course, under Trump's first administration, we saw a lot of that shift, either formally or informally, and it's going to shift again, right? Some of what we should expect to see under the next administration is not new in the US. Previous administrations, whether it be Republican or Democrat, have openly expressed contempt for marginalized people and championed policies that entrench in systemic discrimination. Like, this isn't a new ballgame for any of us in the activism space. Trump in particular, though, on a global stage, he withdrew from so many multilateral spaces, whether it be the Paris Climate Accords or UN agencies, and that's funding and also sort of political credibility. Domestically, we already know the Trump administration is really likely to keep promoting policies that marginalize LGBT youth in schools, and not just LGBT youth, but we're talking about the book bans and the inclusive curricula bans and the censorship of discussions around gender and sexuality and race and racism, of course. And under Trump, we can anticipate federal rollbacks on non-discrimination protections in healthcare, which will deny trans people access to basic services, right? We kind of know the playbook because they've been very, very open about it. But I want to take this moment just to pause and look at the long game of what we've achieved globally as an LGBT rights movement. So Human Rights Watch started our work on LGBT rights in 2004. So about 20 years ago, we started this program. And we were the first international human rights organization to put together a staff, a team dedicated to work on issues of gender and sexuality at a time when it was fairly unpopular, right? So in 2004, 90 countries criminalized adult consensual same-sex conduct. Remember, the US repealed its law in 2003, so it's not ancient history when that was on the books here. Today, that number has dropped to 64 countries that criminalize adult consensual same-sex conduct, which is actually quite a big deal. One of those countries was India in 2018, when the Supreme Court read down their British colonial-era sodomy law. And if you think about that just from a pure population perspective, when India decriminalized, just because of the size of India, that was 1 in 5 of the world's gay people overnight went from being a criminal to not being a criminal. This was a very, very big deal, and it took 17 years of litigation to get there. Going back, 2004, only 2 countries recognized same-sex marriage. Today, it's 35. So we've actually seen quite a bit of growth on that front, including here in the US. In 2004, there were precisely 0 countries on the planet that allowed trans people to be legally recognized, to legally change their gender on the basis of self-identification. Today, we've got 20, and it's a race for the 21st space. We are watching really closely as Mexico and Nepal battle it out. Who's going to be next? It's the kind of race we really like in the human rights movement, because if they're going to battle out to win that, that's fantastic for everyone. So it wasn't that long ago that talking about LGBT issues, even at the United Nations, had to be done in whispers. I can remember during my own professional life what it felt like to be completely not taken seriously when you showed up and that was on your business card, and then being brought into the fold, right? A typical paradigm of naming and shaming the perpetrators of anti-LGBT abuses is not something we have ever really relied on anywhere in the world that we've worked. So the idea that we have this unshameable person back in the White House, yeah, it's awful. He's going to do a lot of really bad things with this power, but we're ready. We're a lot more creative than that. And we don't have to just call out the White House for being bigoted in this way or that way. We've got far more creative ways to help people survive. And that includes at a policy level of putting in some infrastructure to push back.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And you gave us a very good overview also at the work of Human Rights Watch in terms of, the human right at large and democracy. Is there anything else on the democratic front in the US that you want to talk about, that Human Rights Watch's work?
There's so much. And my colleagues who work, our domestic program that works specifically on the US, incredible group of people. They asked me to mention 3 main focuses, and this is ongoing work. They wanted to emphasize that this isn't just reacting to Trump coming back. This is something they've cared about throughout, and these are threads that are ongoing with new research, new advocacy, new ideas. So number 1 is making sure people have access to accurate information to be informed and engaged citizens. On that front, we're working on educational censorship. Number 2, making sure everyone has the right to vote free from discrimination. So we're working on voting rights in general and felony disenfranchisement projects as well to push back on where people with felonies are unable to vote. And number 3, it's making sure that once people elect officials at the local level who actually represent their communities and want to implement strong human rights compliant policies, that they aren't thwarted by efforts to make governments less accountable to the people. So this is a project that we're developing, for example, on state takeover for the administration in a place like Jackson, Mississippi, where there's incredibly patronizing structures put in place saying, no, you've elected your own city council. We're not going to let you actually make any decisions about what you're doing there. So focusing on that. Our targeted projects look at Florida, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Texas, the places where the most regressive legislation is piloted and often successful, and Trump and his allies then pick it up and inject it into the federal system because they've stress tested it there. That's where we're going to try to push back, because that really is the front lines of these types of policy conflicts coming up.
Thank you, Kyle. Thanks again for this very informative overview, and thank you for everything you do locally, nationally, globally as an activist. And now I do want to turn to Summer Lopez, the interim co-CEO and Chief Program Officer of free expression program at PEN America. And Kyle already mentioned the book bans education. Perhaps some of our audience members do know this, but for the past 3 years, City Lights has partnered with PEN America during Ben Books Week, and Summer and I get together with authors, with librarians, students, legal experts to talk about censorship in schools. And I also know that PEN America's work goes beyond book bans. They work on free speech, journalist safety, digital safety, academic freedom, and all of this is very pressing. All of this is very, very pressing right now. So with that, Summer, what's top of mind for you and PEN America? What are you prioritizing?
Thank you so much, Ipek, and thank you all. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm so grateful to City Lights for hosting us to have it. As Ipek and Peter have heard me say this in all the other events we've done, but it always means a lot to me to be part of these events with City Lights because it's a bookstore I used to visit as a child on trips to San Francisco with my mom, coming up from where we lived in the suburbs of LA. We didn't have a lot of independent bookstores, and I think it made a big impact on me then and still means a lot. So it's always a pleasure to be here. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the threats that we are seeing and what we all kind of need to be on the lookout for, and also some of what we can be doing to fight back. And I'll say just a word about PEN America as well, for those who may not be familiar with us. We are an organization of writers dedicated to celebrating and defending freedom of expression in the US and around the world. And we're part of a global network of PEN centers. And I think it's notable to think a little bit about the history of the organization because it really was founded in the wake of World War I, and our founding charter was adopted in the wake of World War II. And so the organization is really rooted in those experiences and in the belief among our founders that writers and literature had a critical role to play in fighting authoritarianism and safeguarding democracy. And they saw that it was writers and artists who were often in a position to challenge the status quo, to hold the powerful to account, and to inspire people to envision a different and better world. And that free expression and open exchange of ideas were essential to having free and democratic societies. So, of course, those are the very reasons we see authoritarians around the world imprison and threaten writers and artists, ban books, and crack down on free expression. So I wanted to say just a bit about some of the threats we're seeing here and that we expect to see intensifying over the next few years. And these include educational censorship, direct attacks on dissent and expression, and then also I think the risk of a broader chilling effect, which I think we can say we're already starting to see even before Inauguration Day. So there's several things in the area of educational censorship, as Ipek said, and as Kyle mentioned, since 2021, we've seen book bans explode across the country. So in the last school year alone, we counted more than 10,000 instances of bans in 29 states. And those bans are disproportionately targeting books by and about LGBTQ plus people, women, and people of color. Everything from The Bluest Eye to And Tango Makes Three, which, if you're not familiar with that one, it's a picture book about two male penguins who raise a chick together. It's been banned a lot. The book bans are also being supercharged by legislation in some states that's making it easier to get a book pulled off the shelves just by challenging it. And all of this is despite the fact that the majority of Americans across the political spectrum oppose book bans and say they want their children to have access to a diversity of stories and books and to accurate information about American history. We've also witnessed a spate of legislation designed to restrict what can be taught and discussed in both K through 12 and college classrooms. We've referred to these bills as educational gag orders, and we've seen 47 of them enacted in 23 states over the last 4 years. And to Fred's point, I think all of this started out as a backlash to both the publication of the 1619 Project and the racial reckonings of 2020. And I think that is what we've continued to see. The most recent report we did on these educational gag orders talked about the fact that their authors are starting to try to kind of hide their censorious intent. They're sort of targeting broader systems that safeguard academic freedom. They're trying to attach the bills to other legislation that's more popular because overt censorship turns out not to be that popular. And yet we've seen so many of these bills pass successfully. But educational censorship has obviously been primarily a state-level issue for the past 4 years. We certainly anticipate seeing federal efforts to turbocharge it wherever possible. We also expect more direct attacks on speech and dissent. So as you mentioned, PEN PEN America has worked on digital safety for journalists and writers for about 7 years now. And we also know that whenever political rhetoric towards the press gets heated, the hate and harassment that journalists face increases as well. So we also anticipate that that will grow alongside offline threats. I think one of the most alarming examples we saw recently was a few months ago. The editor of the Haitian Times was the subject of a swatting attack, which means the SWAT team showed up at her door, guns loaded, in response to a false report of a homicide at her address. And this happened basically shortly after false claims were being made about Haitian immigrants at one of the presidential debates. This was a horrific event and something that we can, I think, anticipate similar things happening in the years to come. At the same time, we've seen the book ban campaign also drive up threats against writers, educators, and librarians. Writers are seeing increasing threats when their books are targeted. And we've seen also states propose laws that could actually send librarians to jail. If you have taken the time to read Project 2025, you may have seen that its introduction basically explicitly equates LGBTQ content with pornography and suggests that educators and librarians should be classed as sex offenders if they provide those books to children. And we also anticipate a sort of broader potential attack on dissenters, civil society. One of the things we're particularly alarmed about right now is HR 9495, which was a bill that didn't pass in the last Congress, but if it comes back in this one, would have serious implications for the nonprofit sector. Essentially, under the guise of fighting terrorism, it gives the Secretary of the Treasury the authority to unilaterally designate a nonprofit organization as a supporter of terrorism and strip them of their nonprofit status. With very little burden of proof on the government, the burden is primarily on the nonprofit organization, creating financial and legal burdens that organizations may not be able to take on. And certainly that could be easily abused to target any nonprofit whose work the government might deem troublesome, from immigrant rights organizations to writing programs, and it could also have a significant broader chilling effect. In an analysis we published earlier this year of Project 2025, we noted that the introduction also calls for a long list of words, including gender and diversity, to be banned from all government documents. And there are any number of horrendous consequences if something like that were to be carried out, but you could also imagine very specifically that writers, artists, academics, anybody who might seek out government funding would feel pressure to basically steer clear of such topics. Which leads me to sort of the broader chilling effect question. And I think this is one of the greatest concerns we have, actually, which is that this increasingly censorious and retributive political environment will drive institutions and individuals to sort of censor themselves in advance. And I think we're already seeing examples of that: universities, media outlets, other institutions shying away from things that might make them targets. In many of our conversations, we've heard of museums putting off potentially controversial exhibits. We've heard from playwrights who are worried that theaters will avoid putting on edgier productions. And I think, we've seen to some degree this already have an impact in the book ban world. We know that, we've heard from teachers and librarians who, for very understandable reasons, are avoiding bringing certain books into the classroom or library because they know the threats that might come along with that. These types of changes can be hard to see and track, but if they're not careful, they can have a really significant impact on our broader cultural landscape. And they're also kind of examples of what experts in authoritarianism call obeying in advance, right? Where you don't actually have to crack down in order to enact censorship. People learn where the red lines are and they avoid them. And this is where solidarity becomes essential, right? Because it can be very hard for a single librarian or a journalist or whoever it may be to assume the risks of standing up and fighting on their own. But if the collective is standing up and fighting together and defending one another, that's how we can be more effective at resisting. So it's on all of us to make sure that we work together to stand firm. And I think in order to do this, we also have to challenge ourselves to get out of our silos and our comfort zones and to engage in that harder dialogue, because the defense of democracy, and we see this in countries all around the world, is most effective when people who disagree on some things, maybe many things, can still come together around the defense of the underlying principles they do all believe in. I think part of what makes PEN unique is that we have long been a place where writers and their allies can come together to defend free expression, even if they disagree on many other things. And that is a rare thing, I think, in today's world, but something we probably need more of. And I think it's important to note as well that on all of these issues, there are people, organizations, and coalitions fighting back, and it's working. For educational gag orders, we've seen legal challenges and activism defeat and challenge laws. We've seen community organizations, parents push back against book bans, and we're working with robust coalitions on all of these issues. So the work is happening, the solidarity is happening, and it definitely is making a difference and making change. So for our audience, there are things you can do as well. I think, first of all, keep writing, documenting, speaking the truth, whatever your piece of this is, keep doing it with bravery. But also keep yourself safe. And we also have resources available to help people do that. And if you don't feel you can do these things safely, you can find other ways to contribute. I think creating space for dialogue and engagement and listening, even with people whose views you might not always agree with, is a critical piece of this. If we all practice a little bit of that, I think it will have a broader impact. And of course, you can also support your local newspapers, your bookstores, your small presses like City Lights. And you can read and buy banned books. I think there's a little bit of a sense out there that sometimes having your book banned is good for business, and that's true for some writers, but not really for the lesser known or more emerging authors. And so they really do need your support as well. We also really encourage people to think about showing up at your school board meetings and making your voice heard about book bans, because we really see as a vocal minority driving this movement, and officials and school board leaders need to hear from other people as well. And certainly we'd be glad to have you as a member of PEN America, so you can always join us too. And I'll just close by saying that as Peter mentioned, before I came to PEN America, I worked on democracy and human rights across government and the nonprofit sector and in a variety of countries. And the threats we are facing in this moment are not about the US alone. There is an authoritarian resurgence happening across the globe, and it's coordinated, right? The authoritarians talk to each other, they learn from one another. But we are also part of a global movement that is committed to defending rights and democracy, and we shouldn't forget that either. So I take tremendous inspiration from the activists and writers I work with here, but also from the activists I've worked with in countries around the world who face grave threats to their freedom and their lives, but don't give up. So thank you so much for having me and for having the opportunity to be a part of this community this evening.
Summer, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing so openly about the challenges as well as the light shining through and the action items, which are so very important. Much appreciated. Thank you. I'm looking at the time and I cannot believe how much ground we covered in just over an hour. That's really remarkable. Thank you all for coming here to share your expertise, your ideas, your inspirations, your insights, highlighting again and again the importance of connection, right? Importance of love and the power of the collective, of collaboration, of solidarity, because without that, we have nothing. And also thank you for everything all of you do for social justice, for human rights, for the environment, for democracy, for our communities. Thank you. And just as I'm bringing it to a close, if that's okay, Peter, I do want to share a quick anecdote. The other day when we were getting ready for this event, Peter shared with me that an intern asked him what keeps him from becoming despondent. And apparently Peter replied, "You need people, people need you, connect, find your tribe, don't be alone at this moment." And in a way, I feel like this is why we have gathered here this evening as well, because we need it. We need this connection, right? So please continue on this path. Reach out to people, talk to them, ask questions, raise questions and listen, and practice hope and then act on it. Thank you all. Thank you so much.